The air was thick, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Kathy stood frozen at the basement door, her hand hovering over the cold brass handle, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers had returned, louder this time, their words unintelligible but unmistakably sinister. It felt as though the very walls of the house were alive, their voices seeping through the cracks, lapping themselves around her mind. She hesitated for just a moment longer before she opened the door and descended into the darkness below. The staircase creaked under her weight, each step sending a shiver of dread down her spine. The air grew colder the further she descended, and Kathy couldn't help but shiver as an icy chill wrapped itself around her. She could feel something or someone following her, but when she glanced behind her, there was nothing but the void of darkness. The house was empty, or so she thought. When she reached the bottom, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Kathy stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the small basement. It was cold, damp, and claustrophobic. The flickering light from the single overhead bulb cast long, twisted shadows across the floor, making the corners of the room seem to move and shift. She strained her ears, listening for the source of the whispers, but all she could hear was a low, guttural growl, almost like a chant. Her breath quickened as she turned to flee, but then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a figure standing motionless in the farthest corner of the row. It was tall, hunched over, its features obscured by the shadows. Kathy's heart stopped in her chest. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The figure seemed to sway slightly, as though it were tethered to the darkness itself, waiting to strike. With a gasp, Kathy spun on her heel and bolted up the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't stop until she reached the safety of the living room, where George was sitting, still unaware of the horror that was unfolding in their home. She collapsed on the couch, trying to catch her breath. "George," she whispered, her voice shaking. "There's something down there. Something not right." George's face hardened as he looked at her, his own fear and confusion reflecting in his eyes. But as much as he wanted to believe it was just her imagination, he couldn't. The house had been changing them. He could feel it too. His temper had become more volatile, his thoughts more chaotic. He had seen things, dark shadows lurking in the corners, heard voices that weren't there. He had tried to push it all aside, to convince himself that it was just stress, but deep down, he knew. The house was changing them. "I don't know what's happening to us, Kathy," George muttered, his voice low. "But we need to get out of here. This place isn't normal." Kathy nodded in agreement, but there was no escape. The house wouldn't let them leave. The days that followed were a blur of terror. George and Kathy tried to live their lives as normally as possible, but every time they entered the house, it felt like something was waiting for them. The walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards creaked under invisible footsteps. At night, the shadows grew longer, creeping across the room, reaching out to touch them. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape the feeling that they were being watched, that something was waiting for the right moment to strike. One afternoon, while George was at work, Kathy decided to take the children out for a walk to clear her mind. As they strolled through the neighborhood, she tried to push the dark thoughts from her head, but they were always there, lurking at the edges of her mind. Every corner, every shadow seemed to remind her of the house. The whispers, the figures in the dark, the constant, suffocating fear. She couldn't escape it. When they returned, the house seemed even darker than before. It was as though it had absorbed the sunlight, trapping the warmth and light outside. Kathy felt an icy chill crawl up her spine as she stepped through the front door. She called out for George, but there was no answer. The silence in the house was overwhelming. It pressed down on her, suffocating her, and she began to feel the weight of the darkness closing in around her. She moved through the rooms, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, until she reached the staircase. And then she heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, but growing louder, coming from the top of the stairs. "Kathy." The voice was soft, almost coaxing, but it was not George's voice. It was a whisper, insistent, almost pleading. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she could feel the cold grip of fear tightening around her chest. "Kathy," the voice repeated. Her heart pounded in her ears as she slowly climbed the stairs, her legs shaking beneath her. She didn't know what she was walking toward, but she had no choice. The voice was calling her, and she couldn't stop herself from going to it. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before her, dark and quiet. The door to the children's room was slightly ajar, and through the crack, she saw something. A figure. It was moving inside the room, its form indistinct, like smoke or mist. Kathy's breath caught in her throat. She reached for the door, her hand trembling, and pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty. The children were nowhere to be seen. But on the floor, in the center of the room, was a symbol, drawn in what looked like blood. The markings twisted and coiled, forming an unrecognizable shape that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Kathy stepped back, her mind racing. The house had done this. It was playing with her, playing with all of them. The haunting reaches its peak. Over the next few days, the family situation worsened. George's mental state began to deteriorate, and Kathy found herself locked in a battle to retain her sanity. The children were no longer the innocent, playful souls they once were. They had grown quiet, withdrawn, their once bright eyes now clouded with fear and confusion. The house had them trapped. There was no way out. Each night, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. The whispers grew louder, more demanding, and every time George tried to leave, he found himself drawn back, as if the house itself was pulling him in. He could feel the pull of it, the lure of the darkness, calling him to stay. He was no longer in control of his own actions. The house had taken hold of him. The final confrontation. One night, in the dead of winter, George finally snapped. The house had been pushing him to the edge for days, and tonight, it seemed to have crossed the line. He was done. He couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed Kathy, pulling her toward the door. The house shook, as if trying to hold them in place. But they wouldn't stop. They ran through the house, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the doors slammed shut, the walls groaned in protest, and the lights flickered violently. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go. Just as they reached the front door, the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, as the doors swung open, a cold wind rushed in, carrying with it a whisper that would haunt them forever. Leave, now, or never return. They didn't need to hear anything more. They ran into the night, away from the house, never looking back.